In today's episode, we've got Edgar Allen Poe, tribal boycotts, and trousing far from home. It's time for Your Jewish Week. Hey everyone, welcome to Your Jewish Week, the podcast for everything Jewish in the week ahead. I'm Rabbi Dovi. As always, this podcast is produced by Chabad.org and dedicated to all our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land. May Hashem keep them safe from all harm, and may all the hostages finally be freed to return to their families and loved ones. Now, this episode is coming out on the Friday before the fast day of Tisha B'Av, which is going to be next Sunday. The reason we're putting it out early, as we'll see, is that learning Torah, which would include the daily study sections of this episode, is not allowed on Tisha B'Av, so we decided to publish this the Friday before. Now, Tisha B'Av is one of the longest fast days of the year, and to make it just a bit easier, you might want to take a quick trip to Hobart, Tasmania, where the fast ends at 5:45 p.m., which is about as early as I found anywhere except for Antarctica. And of course, the fast also starts at 5:15, so you're not really gaining anything, but you've still got that psychological edge, I guess. If you don't care enough about the psychological edge to travel all the way to Tasmania, well, never fear. You can find halachic times for your location quickly and easily at Chabad.org/times. Starting us off, as always, with the weekly Torah portion, in the coming week, we'll be learning the parsha of Va'eschanan, the second parsha in the book of Devarim, which is almost entirely made up of Moshe's final words to the Jews before they enter the Holy Land. Now, just a technical note, as we mentioned a minute ago, Torah learning is not allowed on Tisha B'Av, with several exceptions, and that means the daily study portions should be learned in the afternoon. Now, Sunday, Moshe tells the people how hard he prayed to be given the chance to enter the land of Israel, ultimately without success. He reminds the people to stay faithful to Hashem, calling to mind their sinful behavior with Baal Peor, and pointing out that all those who stick with Hashem's program ultimately come out on top. Going into Monday, he urges the Jews to remember the revelation at Sinai, to treasure the Torah, and to stay far away from worshiping idols. Otherwise, he warns, they will find themselves banished from their land, cast into exile in strange places, such as England, where they drive on the wrong side of the road and call pants trousers. But Moshe also promises that even as they trouse in faraway lands, Hashem will never forsake them and will ultimately bring them home. In Tuesday's Aliyah, Moshe designates 3 cities of refuge on the far side of the Jordan River. As we touched upon last week, these provide safe spaces for accidental killers to shelter from retribution. Wednesday and Thursday, we'll have a recap of the revelation at Sinai and the 10 Commandments. Now, they're repeated almost verbatim from the first time they were written back in Parshas Yisro, but there are a few key differences. If you're wondering why that is, check out the link in the show notes. Friday and Shabbat, we wrap up the Parsha with some more admonitions for the Jewish people. Moshe warns them not to forget Hashem in the midst of all their success and prosperity, and directs them to destroy the current corrupt inhabitants of Canaan, obliterate their idols, and take their land. Included in this last little chunk, by the way, is the first paragraph of Shema, probably the most iconic Jewish prayer, which touches upon the oneness of Hashem and the obligation to love Him and fulfill His mitzvot. Parshas Va'eschanan contains 118 verses, with the memory key being the name Uziel. As always, check out the link in the show notes for more insight into this week's key. In the weekly Tanya, we're going to be making our way through the collection of letters known as Igeres HaKodesh. As we mentioned last week, this section of Tanya is a bit of a grab bag of different themes and topics. Case in point, from Sunday to Thursday, we'll be studying another letter on the topic of tzedakah, giving to the poor. Specifically, this letter outlines the effect that tzedakah has in the context of spiritual self-improvement. Then on Thursday, we'll begin a lengthy letter that's going to go straight through to next Tuesday. Now, right at the end, it's going to tie in once again to the virtue of tzedakah, and this time it's coming at it from a bit of a different angle. We'll see the effect that tzedakah has on Hashem and His relationship with us. Now, to get there, we're going to be heading into some fairly dense Kabbalistic stuff this week, which is going to include a lot of the concepts we explored in earlier parts of Tanya. Moving on to the daily Rambam, the 3-chapter and Sefer HaMitzvos tracks are continuing with the rules and regulations of the Holy Temple. Right at the beginning of Sunday, we'll wrap up the list of factors that prevent a person from working in the temple. We covered most of those last week. And then straight through to Wednesday, we'll be learning the laws of Isurei Mizbeach, animals that are forbidden to be offered as sacrifices on the altar. The basic idea is that if you're giving a gift to someone, you're going to want to make sure that the thing you're giving is presentable. If it's not fit to be a gift, or if it's damaged or dirty, not only will it not have the intended effect, it'll do the opposite, right? It'll be an insult. So when we bring a sacrifice to Hashem, there's a whole bunch of boxes we have to check to make sure it's worthy, and we'll go over all of those. Wednesday will begin the laws of sacrifices, systematically going through all the types of sacrifices that are offered in the temple and describing the whole procedure. We're really going to get into a lot of detail on that. It's going to take us straight through to next week. In the 1-chapter track, we're moving right along with the laws of neighbors. Sunday, we'll go over municipal stuff, describing what city expenses the inhabitants of the city can legally be forced to pay. Monday through Friday, we'll really get into the neighbor stuff. We'll discuss all sorts of cases that pop up when human beings live close to one another. For instance, if my wall overlooks your backyard, I can't open a window in that wall because you have a right to privacy. I also can't do anything that damages you, even very slightly. For instance, I can't make a new drainage gutter that drips water into your property. Now, it might sound petty, but these kind of laws are actually some of the most practically applicable laws in the Torah. Every day, rabbinical courts all over the world adjudicate cases just like these. And on Shabbat, we'll head into another area of the laws of neighbors known as bar metzra. No, not bar mitzvah, bar metzra, it's a totally different thing. So here's the premise. If you're going to own 2 fields, it's much more convenient and cost-effective to have 2 fields next to one another. That way you can plow and water and sow and harvest them both in one shot. So if someone sells his field, the owner of the adjoining field, that's called the bar metzra, is legally empowered to go up to the buyer, pay him the purchase price, and then take the field. The idea behind this is that the buyer can buy a field wherever, but to the neighbor, the bar metzra, this field is uniquely convenient. And the Torah mandates us to do what is good and just, and in this case, the buyer loses nothing and the bar metzra gains something. Now, obviously, if the buyer is losing out somehow, the whole law doesn't apply, and that's why there are many, many exceptions to this rule, which the Rambam is going to detail for us. As always, if you'd like to learn more about anything you just heard, or if you're interested in joining one of the daily study cycles, check out the show notes for links and resources. All right, with the weekly overview done, it's time to take it day by day. As we mentioned in the opener, Sunday is going to be the fast day of Tisha B'Av. At the end of last week's episode, we laid out the pre-fast preparations and the procedure for Saturday night when the fast begins. If you need a refresher on those or on any of the laws we're going to mention now, check out the link in the show notes. First and foremost, Tisha B'Av is, of course, a fast day, and that means no eating, no drinking. As with all fast days, there's obviously exceptions in the case of severe illness and danger to life, but it's important to note that Tisha B'Av is one of the most stringent fasts. We'll get to why that is in a minute. So definitely consult a rabbi if you feel that you're unable to fast to make sure you have all the relevant details about that. Due to the intense mourning of this day, there's a couple other pleasurable activities that we avoid. We don't wear leather shoes, we don't bathe or wash at all, not even our hands. If you need to wash your hands for halachic purposes, like the natilat yadayim in the morning, we only wash till our knuckles, not to our wrists like usual. We also don't put on creams or ointments, we don't give gifts, wear snazzy clothes, or take trips. Check out the link I mentioned earlier for a full rundown on the prohibited activities on this day. Also, as we mentioned earlier, we don't learn Torah except for subjects that relate to mourning and the destruction of the Holy Temple. In particular, the Rebbe's custom is to study the Medrash on the book of Eicha and to learn the account of the destruction of the Holy Temple that appears on the 55th page of Tractate Gittin in the Talmud. I'll attach a link in the show notes to Chabad.org's online Talmud with translation. If you want to check it out, it goes on for quite a few pages and it's very rich in detail. If you've ever been to the home of someone who recently lost a parent, you might have noticed that the mourners sit on low chairs. For this reason, we sit only on low chairs during the first part of Tisha B'Av from nightfall until halachic midday. By low chairs, I mean 3 handbreadths in Talmudic terms, which comes out to approximately 10 inches or lower. There's a couple exceptions to this custom. Pregnant or nursing women can sit on regular chairs if needed, and the person who raises the Torah in shul sits on a regular chair as well until the Torah is returned to the ark. In the morning, we also say kinot, like mournful poems and prayers to commemorate the tragedies of the day. You can find a link to that in the show notes. And again, we only say that during the first part of the day until halachic midday. Also, during the first part of Tisha B'Av, we avoid any professional work, business, or very involving manual tasks. If you've got a pressing matter that could lead to loss if it's not dealt with, there is room for leniency, so ask your local rabbi. Now, interestingly, despite this being a day of great mourning and sadness, we actually skip Tachnun in all of our prayers, just as we would on a holiday. Another important change to the prayers, men do not wear tefillin during the morning prayers. Instead, they put them on in the afternoon for mincha. Again, check out the link in the show notes for more on Tisha B'Av laws and restrictions. In Jewish history, Tisha B'Av is an absolute train wreck as expected. No way to sugarcoat it. That's why the laws are much stricter on this day than they are on some of the other fasts. Starting way back in biblical times, this was the day after the spies arrived back from their tour of the land of Canaan. Now, the Jews had all been convinced that they were going to die the minute they entered the land, so they were crying hysterically, which prompted Hashem to step in and basically say, "All right, I'll give you something to cry about." That was in the year 2449 from creation, and it was only the beginning of Tisha B'Av's long and storied career as the primary raisin in the cookie of history. I say that because raisins in cookies are gross, in case that wasn't clear to anyone. In the years 3338 and 3829, respectively, Tisha B'Av was the date of the destruction of the first and second holy temples. A couple decades later, in 3893, it was also the date when the stronghold city of Beitar, the last stand of an ill-fated revolt against the Romans, was obliterated after a 3-year siege. The account of the fall of Beitar is actually recorded in the Talmud in the same section of Tractate Gittin that I mentioned earlier. Again, you'll find the link to that in the show notes. I assume it's still there. As a bit of a history aficionado, I've read tons of grim descriptions of nasty things, and you don't need me to tell you that human beings are very good at hurting one another. But with that said, the account of the siege and destruction of Beitar is truly awful. Well over 500,000 Jews were killed, adding another macabre feather to Tisha B'Av's cap. Fast forward all the way to the secular year 1290, Tisha B'Av was the day that King Edward I of England officially expelled the Jewish people from his kingdom. Now, what made this especially rough was the fact that his kingdom happened to be on an island, and any scientist will tell you that leaving an island involves crossing water. The problem is, Tisha B'Av is apparently a nasty time of year for weather on the English Channel, and many of the Jews who were forced to leave drowned when their ships capsized in storms. Others fell prey to pirates. Almost exactly 2 centuries later, in 1492, another expulsion took place on this same day, the famous Alhambra Decree, the expulsion of the Jews of Spain. This event marked the end of a centuries-long Jewish presence in that country, and as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, the expulsion wasn't fully repealed until 1968. In 1815, Tisha B'Av marks the yahrzeit of Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak Horowitz, widely known as the Chose of Lublin. Now, Chose means one who sees, and Lublin, according to legend, is a town somewhere in Poland. Now, in English, the Chose is known as the seer of Lublin, probably because seer is a fantastic word. How often do you have an excuse to use the word seer? Whenever the seer of Lublin comes up in conversation, I make a point of saying his name as often as possible because it's just so cool. Anyway, the seer of Lublin, as the name suggests, was renowned for his miracles and divine perception. The seer was a major Hasidic Rebbe and really helped popularize the Hasidic movement in Poland. Everyone was talking about the seer, sharing the seer's Torah thoughts, and going to see the seer to ask the seer for advice. Seriously. Now, before we move on, I think it's important to bring up one silver lining on the whole dumpster fire that is Tisha B'Av. The Talmud relates that as the Holy Temple was burning, a Jew far away was plowing his field. Apparently, he hadn't really been looped into what was going on. There was no social media in those days, according to archaeologists, when suddenly, out of the blue, his cow let out with an almighty moo. Now, a certain Arab was passing by, and evidently this Arab had a certain spiritual perception. I guess he was also something of a seer. He was able to interpret the cow's sudden noise, and he turned to the Jew and said, "Your holy temple was just destroyed." Then all at once, the cow gave another moo. He was really on a roll. And the Arab reported that this second moo signified that the Redeemer of the Jewish people, the righteous Mashiach, had just entered the world. So even as the horrible events of Tisha B'Av were unfolding, the potential for redemption was being brought into the world. Like a seed, that redemptive power has grown and grown throughout our history, and today we stand, as the Rebbe tells us many times, on the cusp of the final redemption with Mashiach. May it be speedily in our days. Monday, the 10th of Av, we've got, unfortunately, some more bad news. I'm going to run through it quickly, if you don't mind. In 1306, Philip IV expelled the Jews of France on this day. Legend says that the French army saw the Jews despondently retreating into exile and decided to adopt that as their primary military doctrine going forward. And in the 700 years since, they have distinguished themselves as the widely acknowledged experts on retreating from stuff. A couple hundred years later, in 1496, the government of Portugal followed the example of the Spanish and expelled their Jews as well on this day. Fast forward all the way to 1994, the 10th of Av was the day that a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, Argentina was bombed, killing 86 and wounding over 300 in the worst terror attack outside of Israel since the Holocaust. And just under a decade later, the Israeli government made the unspeakably stupid and misbegotten choice to pull the Jewish presence out of Gaza and give it to the Palestinians. Now, the official deadline was the 10th of Av, that's why I'm mentioning it here, but it took them nearly a month to fully move everyone out. Now, infamously, this included tearing Jewish families from their homes in the flourishing Gush Katif area, sometimes literally dragging them away. I suppose the Israelis thought this would make the Arabs happy, but of course it backfired miserably, and I don't need to tell you what ended up happening in Gaza. It was an appalling example of misplaced mercy to the cruel, and to this day, the results of that catastrophe continue to inflict cruelty to the merciful. On a brighter note, a very happy birthday to Yisachar, the son of our forefather Yaakov. He passed away at the age of 122, but if he hadn't, today would be his 3,589th birthday, if my math is correct. Of course, there's a very good chance my math is not correct, and that's one of the reasons that leads me to conclude that I am not from the tribe of Yisachar, because the descendants of Yisachar were known for their wisdom, particularly in the areas of math and astronomy that go into calculating the Jewish calendar, and you guys already know I avoid that stuff like the plague. Before we move on, just a quick halachic note for the 10th of Av. Although Tisha B'Av is over, the mourning practices of the 9 days continue until halachic midday on Monday. So you're going to want to hold off on the wine drinking, meat eating, and laundry washing until then. Tuesday, the 11th of Av, things are looking up because we've got another one of those delightful local Purims we love to feature on this show. This time, it's Purim Baghdad. Yes, another one. I think we already had a Purim Baghdad a few months ago. I guess people from Baghdad really like their Purims. Now, they say that people who go by three names are either going to be famous authors like Edgar Allan Poe or Louisa May Alcott, or they're going to shoot a president like Lee Harvey Oswald or John Wilkes Booth. If you've got three names and you're regularly addressed by all three of them, those are apparently the only career options open to you. And that's a shame because it means that if you're no good at writing, you've got no recourse but to turn to violence. But it wasn't always this way. Back in the day, you could also be a Persian conqueror or an Ottoman nobleman. Case in point, in 1733, a fellow by the name of Nader Shah Afshar, I'm definitely not pronouncing that right, led an army of Persians to capture Baghdad, which was defended by another guy named Topal Osman Pasha. Again, my pronunciation is probably way off, but he's not alive to correct me. As these two evenly matched triple namers faced off, the Jews prayed for Topal Osman Pasha to come out on top because the Ottomans at that time treated the Jews way better than the Persians. And sure enough, on this day, the 11th of Av, Topal Osman Pasha finally won. Yippee! The Jews marked the day as a mini holiday from then on. Also on the 11th of Av, we've got the yahrzeit of Rabbi Hillel Paritcher, an outstanding chassid of both the second Rebbe of Chabad, Rabbi Dovi Paltiel, as well as his son-in-law and successor, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, the Tzemach Tzedek. Now, Rabbi Hillel, as he was known, was a remarkably gifted person, a brilliant scholar, and a deeply religious person. One of the crazy things that's said about Reb Hillel is that his body subconsciously adhered to the strictest word of Torah law, even when he wasn't actively aware of it. Think of it this way. It's an unfortunate fact that parents occasionally leave their kids in hot cars by accident. It's tragic, it's awful, and thank God they're coming up with ways to avoid it. Actually, we just got a device like that for our car. Check out the link in the show notes for a news story on that. But at the end of the day, people make mistakes, and I think we kind of understand how something like that could, God forbid, happen. But have you ever heard of someone just accidentally walking out the door without their pants? Just forget to put them on the way out? Never, right? At least not outside of Australia. So Reb Hillel Parcher was known to kind of work the same way when it came to halacha, to Jewish law. Even minute nuances of Jewish law that most people never think about were so ingrained in him, he literally felt them physically. There's one law, for instance, that says that you can't drive over a bridge while you're sleeping. It's in the Code of Jewish Law. It's a Torah prohibition, and it has to do with some pretty straightforward safety considerations. Well, it was known that if Reb Hillel was sleeping on a long wagon ride, he would automatically wake up the instant the wheel started over a bridge. Similarly, Reb Hillel would wake up automatically if someone covered the mezuzah on his door or if his kippah fell off in his sleep. This was a man whose life centered so entirely around his relationship with Hashem, it became baked into the deepest instincts of his psyche, which is pretty darn impressive. Wednesday, the 12th of Av, marks the day when Agudas Chasidei Chabad, the Central Chabad Lubavitch organization, purchased the building at 770 Eastern Parkway that would soon become known as the Chabad World Headquarters. That purchase happened in 1940, and in the 85 years since then, 770 has not only become visibly iconic, it's also been the spiritual center for Jewish life everywhere. There's a term that comes from the Talmud, you'll often hear it used in reference to 770, Beis Rabbeinu Shebebavel, the house of our teacher in Babylonia. The idea is that the Holy Temple in Yerushalayim isn't just a building, it's a hub of divine energy. The blessings and life force for the entire Jewish people would flow through it. Now, during the time of exile, when the Holy Temple is no longer serving that function, it's obviously tragic. That's one of the reasons we yearn for Mashiach so much, but that still doesn't mean we're completely out to dry. The energy that used to go through the Holy Temple is redirected somewhere else. Throughout this long exile, that energy flows through the primary base of the Nasi, the leader of the Jewish people in each generation. And that place is what we call the Beis Rabbeinu Shebebavel. So aside from 770's role as a landmark, aside from all the politicians and dignitaries who have visited it, aside from all the incredible events that took place there and continue to take place there, it's the building's role as Beis Rabbeinu Shebebavel that really sets it apart from anywhere else on earth. It's a place to get inspired, it's a place to take strength, and if you haven't been there before, I strongly suggest you go. And even if you have been there before, still go. All right, jumping all the way to Shabbat, we end off the week at the polar opposite of where we started, the 15th of Av, one of the happiest days on the Jewish calendar. We skip the Tachnun throughout our prayers and the grace after meals, as we do on holidays. There's quite a few historical reasons for this, and many of them are related to the tragic events we commemorated at the beginning of the week. It's kind of the positive flip side. If you recall from a couple minutes ago, the first historical calamity of Tisha B'Av was the decree that all adult men from the age of 20 to the age of 60 would gradually die out in the desert as punishment for the sin of the spies. Only once they were all gone would their children be able to enter the land. And the way that worked was that each successive generation of 60-year-olds would die in their sleep on the night of Tisha B'Av, the anniversary of the decree. That's why the Jews wandered for 40 years in the desert. It took 40 years for the youngest age bracket, the 20-year-olds, to reach 60 and die. At least, that's what you would think. But 38 years later, on the 15th of Av, it was officially confirmed that the dying had stopped. And here's how they figured that out. Every Tisha B'Av, the anniversary of the decree, all the 60-year-old men prepared to die. But in the year 2487, they didn't die. They got back up in the morning. Well, this was puzzling, right? Everyone assumed there must have been some mistake in the calendar. Perhaps the next night was actually Tisha B'Av. So the next night, they said their goodbyes once again, and once again, they woke up in the morning. Now, still, they remained wary. They didn't want to be over-optimistic. But on the 15th of the month, the moon was full, proving conclusively that it was the middle of the month, again, because Jewish months go by the lunar cycle. and the 9th of Av had come and gone. As you can imagine, there were massive parties in honor of, well, not dying. Later in history, the 15th of Av was again marked for celebration, and to understand why, we're going to have to go back to last week's Torah portion. If you recall, Hashem decreed that the daughters of Tzlafchad, who inherited their father's ancestral land, could only marry within their own tribe. Now, why was this? Well, if the daughters of Tzlafchad would marry someone from another tribe, let's say Reuven, their children would all be considered Reuvenites. Now, when they died, these Reuvenite children would inherit their mother's property. So what you'd end up with is ancestral land from the section of Menashe, that's the tribe Tzlafchad came from, being given to a Reuvenite family. This would cause all sorts of confusion, so it was decreed that the daughters of Tzlafchad and any other girls in a similar situation could only marry their own tribespeople. But this only applied during the initial period of conquest and settlement of the land of Canaan. After 14 years, the Jewish people were firmly settled and organized in the land, and on the 15th of Av, the ban was lifted. In a bit of a historical echo, a couple centuries later, the 15th of Av was the day when the tribe of Binyamin was once again allowed to marry into the rest of the Jewish population. A little while earlier, a whole bunch of people from the tribe of Binyamin, like an entire city's worth of people, had perpetrated some pretty unspeakable nastiness that I won't describe here. The bottom line is, as a result of this, the rest of the Jewish people waged a war on them and declared a ban against marrying their children. Now, eventually it became clear that this marriage boycott would eventually depopulate the tribe entirely, so it was abolished on the 15th of Av sometime in the late 2500s, and again, that meant that a tribe of Israel wasn't going to be extinguished, so it was a pretty happy day. Little over 400 years later, on the 15th of Av 2964, a king named Hoshea called in a demolition job, which was very good news. To explain why, we're going to need some more historical context. This is turning out to be a very long episode. Anyway, after Shlomo HaMelech, aka King Solomon, died, his son, Rechavam, was being a bit too harsh. So 10 of the 12 tribes decided to break off and make their own kingdom called the Kingdom of Israel. Now, the first king of this new kingdom was named Yeravam, and he was a bad boy of historic proportions. He's literally the go-to example in the Talmud for someone who sinned and caused the masses to also sin. And the reason he did that was as follows. Yeravam realized that 3 times a year, all the Jewish men from both kingdoms would come to Yerushalayim to celebrate the main holidays in the Holy Temple. They'd been doing this for thousands of years, but the problem was the Holy Temple was in the southern kingdom of Yehuda, and Yeravam was not really loving the fact that a nice chunk of his population was spending so much time in enemy territory. Well, what do you want us to do? The Jews asked him. This is our religion. So Yeravam's like, no worries, I've got a shiny new religion for you guys. My wife Izebel comes from the kingdom of Tsur, and she's got this cool new god called Baal. It's super convenient, pocket-sized, you can worship him at home, fully wireless, just 5 easy payments of $49.99. Now, somehow, despite that fantastic pitch, a lot of Jews still kind of liked worshiping the creator of the world for some reason. All right, you know what, said Yeravam, I'm just going to put up roadblocks between this kingdom and Yerushalayim. What you going to do now? And unfortunately, thousands of Jews were prevented from performing the holiday pilgrimage, and eventually the Baal idol became an enormous problem and led to all kinds of unpleasantness for a very long time afterwards. So when Hoshea, the last king of the breakaway kingdom, finally removed them over 200 years later, it was a cause for great celebration. I think this is going to be the longest episode ever, I'm realizing. We're barely halfway through the list. Anyways, carrying on. A handful of centuries later, on the 15th of Av 3893, was the day when the massacred Jews in the city of Beitar, which was destroyed on Tisha B'Av, in case you forgot, were finally allowed to be buried. For 15 years, the Romans had made it impossible for the Jews to bury them, which brought tremendous dishonor to all the martyrs and was a cause of great sorrow for the Jewish people. When they finally gave permission on the 15th of Av, it was a massive relief for the whole nation. And what was even more astounding was that the bodies were found to be perfectly intact after a decade and a half, an unmistakable miracle and a glimmer of Hashem's love and mercy during a very dark period in our history. In fact, the blessing of Hatov v'Hametiv, the longer final blessing in the grace after meals, was instituted to give thanks to Hashem for this very event. The 15th of Av was also a special day for matchmaking in ancient times. The Talmud and tractate Tainus recounts that all the unmarried girls would put on plain white clothes so that nobody would be embarrassed by being underdressed, and they would go out to the vineyards for a kind of matchmaking trade convention. All the single men would meet them there and hopefully find themselves a wife. Back in temple times, the 15th of Av was a notable day for another reason. As you know, a central feature of the Holy Temple was the altar where they would offer up sacrifices, and the wood they would use to burn those sacrifices had to be really dry. So the procedure was that they would only cut wood during the summer months. They'd stock up a whole year's worth of wood during that time. The 15th of Av was the cutoff date for wood cutting season, and a ceremony was held in which an axe would be symbolically broken. It was called Yom Tavar Magal, the day of the broken axe. And last but not least, the 15th of Av is brought in the Talmud as the pivot point when the nights start getting longer. Now, night is the primary time of Torah learning. Just on a practical level, people who work during the day do their Torah study at night, but also on a deeper spiritual level. The Talmud tells us that the night was created for Torah study. So with the nights getting longer, it's an ideal time to increase our Torah learning. In fact, the Code of Jewish Law says that those who increase their Torah learning during this time will have their lifespans increased. Now this year, the 15th of Av also falls out on the Shabbat after Tisha B'Av, which has its own special name, Shabbos Nachamu, the Shabbat of consolation. Nachamu comes from the first word of this week's Haftorah, which is the first of 7 Haftorahs on the theme of consolation, comforting the Jewish people after the tragedies of Tisha B'Av and reminding them of the bright future ahead. After a whiplash week of ups and downs, tragedy and celebration, and an unforgivable 32-minute-long episode, this is where we close, mindful of our past, yearning for Mashiach, but with optimism and hope for good news to come in the week ahead. Your Jewish Week is produced by Chabad.org, written and recorded by me, Rabbi Dovi Paltiel. Theme music by Levi Kloshak.